Tell us how this book came about.
British Weird came about because, and this is British Weird, look, it's lovely. I was reviewing a book called something like British Weird Fiction, 1890 to 1950, by James Machin, who is a British scholar. He teaches at the Royal Academy of Art. And I was reviewing it going, this is great, this is really interesting, it's a proper new history of weird fiction in British literature, but where are the women? And from that, Women's Weird came. That was last year. But at the same time, I thought, well, I need James Machin to do a collection for us on British weird fiction. So we took a long time over it, selecting the stories, arguing about what was too long, what was good enough, and so on. But he did all the research. I pitched in a few that I wanted to go in, and I said I also would like this author to go in, and then he had the suggestion that we also included a really important essay from 1933 by Mary Butts, who was one of the early theorists of supernatural writing, and she's really important. This essay is hard to get hold of, so that was another really good addition. So it was a collaborative effort. I started it, I commissioned it, but James and I together worked on it to put the book into shape.
How did you and James actually select the stories?
Well, he looked for them. He has a much wider knowledge of what fiction in this period, what he wanted to include. But the brief was they had to be British authors, and the stories needed to illustrate something very typical and also unusual about weird fiction written by British authors from the 1890s right through to the Second World War. So with those parameters, he could select the authors and then choose from the author's stories. But we were also concerned to not republish stories that were already in the public domain, if we could help it, or to publish stories that were difficult to get hold of. And he made a couple of really good discoveries. There are two authors in here who have never been republished since the 1930s, and their stories are just extraordinary. So he's made proper discoveries.
Were there any stories that you wanted but couldn't fit in?
Yes, there was one. By an extremely well-known author, who I won't name, but the estate wanted a colossal amount of money for the story. We simply couldn't afford it. It would have been a wonderful addition. It's a great story, but we only have a small budget, so we dropped that and we inserted fortuitously a new discovery that James had made, which was a little bit shorter, but that was fine. So these are the choices you have to make. We only have a limited amount of money to spend on the permission fees for the stories that are in copyright. And there's a danger if you have too many stories in the collection which are out of copyright, they will also be available anywhere else, so why would anyone want to buy the book? So it's important with the new anthology to include stories that are difficult because they're in copyright and nobody else has bought the rights. So we had a balancing act to do.
Why a British collection?
Because I'm British, because James is British, because British writing has a very particular tradition. And weird fiction is usually held to have begun with H.P. Lovecraft in the 1920s and possibly a little earlier. He was an American writer, and so his influence, which was really enormous, has permeated writing about horror, writing about supernatural from that period. I wanted to find different strands of the tradition which had come from a very, very separate source. So people could see, so this was written about in Britain 20 years before Lovecraft was even published. Well, isn't that interesting? Perhaps this will tell us where Lovecraft got his ideas from. So we're not saying that British weird writing was more important than, or particularly more special than what Lovecraft did, but we wanted to show that it's important. It was already happening.
Are there connections to women's weird?
There are. Women's Weird, which we brought out in 2019, contains stories by Mary Butts and by Edith Nesbit, and we have two stories, different stories by Edith Nesbit and Mary Butts in this collection. So there's a little crossover, but there's no repetition.
What makes a story weird?
Weird fiction is a catch-all term that was created after Lovecraft became famous in the 30s. Now it generally is understood by writing about the supernatural events, about horror, about ghosts. You can have a certain amount of mystery and detection, but it has to be stories that are expected to scare you and to chill you. Melissa Edmondson defines weird as fiction that's got something a little bit off about it, something that's really not quite right, morally, ethically, or in good taste. There's something a bit iffy. That's her definition. I think it's a really interesting one, and actually a lot of these stories might come into that category, but some of them might not. But the essential quality is supernatural and horror, the two combined.